Mick, thanks for joining me
Mic
up
as
on
well.
stage.
Yeah, my mic working? Yeah, it is.
Two mics make a right on St. Paddy's Day only. We're going to,
Thursday nights as well.
well, as long as we remain appropriately socially distanced, we can. It's not Thursday night. It's Wednesday, isn't it? Right. I don't even know what day of the week it is. Tells you what sort of week I've been having. Now, they often say, while we're waiting for our guests to come in on the Zoom call, that if you are explaining, you're losing in public relations. I think it was Ronald Reagan who said that. I think it's in an environment that this context of messaging, and welcome to the Van Hillers, it's in this environment that you're talking about the plastics industry reclaiming the messaging, and it's so heavily skewed against them, as we've seen. And obviously a very big task to do in an environment where, as I say, if you're explaining, you're losing. What is the starting point, really, for a company to approach this idea of communicating and advertising their product when they're not used to doing that? They're a B2B almost business. They're not a consumer-facing business. Where do you even start?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we find that a lot of companies have sustainability as a piece of paper or a document in the company that travels from department to department, and it's paid lip service because one feels one has to. But if one's going to future-proof your business, if one's going to mitigate the risk of a potential backlash towards a business that deals particularly in plastic or any environmentally damaging product potentially, I think the starting point obviously is a strategy. You know, we often get requests for campaigns, and I always say to our clients, you can't go out there and say something without having the reason why, what, how, and where to say it first, because the potential for backlash or the potential for risk is incredibly high. So one has to dedicate the time and resource to put together a proper sustainability strategy and messaging and how to communicate those things.
Because without that, I suppose the public at large would quite quickly see through it, and it lacks authenticity.
I think particularly if you're a company that hasn't communicated before to the public and you're not used to it, then the potential for risk is very high, because it just takes one naysayer to say something bad on social media, and if it gets picked up, potentially that's very damaging for your business. So absolutely, you have to be careful about what you say, and you have to understand what the potential risk is and prepare for it ahead of time. To your point, in terms of PR particularly, when the backlash comes, and it will come in some form or another, how prepared are you and what do you say?
Yeah, and particularly in this industry, where, let's face it, I mean, you can't pussyfoot around the issue that the plastics value chain, big chemicals companies, oil and gas giants, have spent globally billions of dollars on lobbyists and campaigns for decades, pushing back against this. Yeah. But we had a slide earlier with David Attenborough saying that the sea change in opinion is akin to when the opinion changed globally around slavery. You can't push back against that.
Yeah.
So being mindful of that, what sort of pushback do you expect from this campaign?
Well, we've been pleasantly surprised that in this campaign, because we reframed the issue and we made it a call to plastic responsibly and sort of polarized what responsible and irresponsible plastic is, we found that we've had almost zero backlash. In fact, we've had a lot of compliments around it. But I think, in essence, it goes back to what you were saying. If you're spending billions or millions of dollars or rands defending or fighting back, you're going to lose, because that's not how the social world works. And, you know, a lot of us in big business and corporates, we tend to ignore that social world. But that social world has been the undoing of quite a few companies, or certainly cost them a lot of money. So one has to have the conversation where the conversation is happening. And I think it's more about having that enabling conversation which says, we agree with you, but this is not a challenge, it's an opportunity. You know, in the plastic world, plastic has a value. Plastic is highly recyclable, et cetera, et cetera. So there's an opportunity here to work together to do what you want to do, which is save the planet. And I feel that education rather than defense is the way to go.
And we'll come back to how that plays out in an arena where you talk about social and you talk about the public pressure. We see a lot of pressure from regulators as well. I recently hosted a panel on biomaterials where some of the demand-side levers, again, being considered are outright bans, taxes, and that on an industry that is a big employer and that has all of these benefits that are not spoken about and are not articulated. I think it's a big challenge. Yeah. Nikki, to pop over to you, your study indicates that the consumer is currently repurposing ice cream containers for other applications. I certainly do that all the time, yogurt tins and margarine and all the rest of it. Is this not in contradiction to the reuse business model, which promotes reuse of packaging for the same application?
Michael, thanks so much for having us. I think actually we've been digging into some of the extended producer responsibility literature that's out there, and on a global level, actually repurposing reusing doesn't necessarily mean it has to go back and be reused for the exact same purpose. We use the word in our research around repurposing rather than reusing. But essentially what you're doing by reusing the material or the tubs for some other purpose is keeping them out of the waste stream. You're applying them into some shape or form that keeps them in a useful life for a much longer period of time. So I think it's totally actually in line with the circular economy, particularly if once those products have been used, they come back into the recycling space to be recycled and made back into something else that can be reused or used effectively.
So just to be clear, you believe that repurposing packaging for other applications is actually part of the circular economy concept that we're trying to mainstream?
Yes, and I think that's one of the dangers when you become too purist on something. You become so hell-bent on keeping the rules exactly the way they are, rather than saying, well, what are we trying to achieve here? We're trying to keep materials in use for as long as possible, get a maximum value out of them while they're still there, then bring them back, convert them, take them back into something that can be converted and reused again for another life. So I think sticking too strictly to the closed loop system can ultimately result in us actually losing more to the environment and creating more waste at the end of the day. As Rob said, I think he talks about in his milk packaging study, HD and LD packaging cannot be used at this stage back into food grade. Polypropylene is the same. We don't have the technology yet to go from food grade material, recycle it back into food grade material. So while we can't do that, let's use it as best as we possibly can for as long as possible.
On that point, and Rob, maybe to bring you in here, how do we inform this conversation around plastics? Because there is still a lot of myth, a lot of folklore, as I mentioned earlier, in this conversation.
I mean, I think that education, not just consumer education, but education through the entire value chain is important. And I mean, I think just going on to the white cap challenge that I ended my presentation with, it's very often there's small changes that can have significant impacts. And it's educating everyone from, everyone in the value chain, including the consumer and everyone who's involved in the post-use or the post-consumer value chain, to understand how everything fits together, that it's a big integrated system, and that decisions that may be seemingly insignificant or arbitrary that are made at one stage in the value chain can have significant impacts either upstream or downstream, the way they can potentially influence decision making, or they can make a product that's inherently recyclable and inherently attractive for recycling less attractive. Education is critically important, but I think there's often a strong focus on consumer education, not necessarily on entire value chain education.
To that point, who takes the lead there? Nikki, to bring you in, because we often hear that it's the value chain, everyone needs to take ownership, everyone needs to take responsibility, and in that environment you have everyone pointing at everyone else and no one taking responsibility. Someone's ultimately got to take the lead to spearhead this education drive.
Absolutely, Michael. And I think this is where the new EPR legislation, I'm hoping, will make quite a big difference, because essentially we're forcing, through legislation, a mandatory taking of responsibility through the value chain. So a brand owner will have to identify their producer responsibility organization that will look after their materials post-life or post-use. And those PROs will be responsible for putting together the consumer education campaigns, also working on the education through the value chain. So I think as we get more and more cohesion and collaboration between brand owners, packaging manufacturers, and the producer responsibility organizations, that will start happening. I also think that organizations such as the SA Initiative to End Plastic Waste, there's a very big role for that to play in terms of looking at how do we educate across the value chain. The Plastics Pact. So it really is coming up with a logical way of doing it and getting one or two organizations to work together, but being pushed, as I say, by the brand owners in particular, but also people like Safripol, who really, I know, having worked with them, their heart's in the right place. They want to do the right thing. They're not the people who should be doing the education necessarily, but they can be working with the PROs, getting information out there and helping it get disseminated.
Mick, I mean, you
just
understand.
to add to that, I think it's...
Carry on, Robert.
I think the other critical thing is that there needs to be a cohesive message that goes out, that everybody's telling that there's a consistent story, there's a consistent thread to the education that's going out there. It doesn't help to have one step in the value chain or one group, whether it's civil society or whether it's within the industry, saying one thing and then being contradicted by other people. So I think that the messaging needs to be clear and consistent, and the moment you get inconsistencies, that's when you can start to lose the impact of that message.
Thank you. It's just a bit of a struggle to see you around the bush there. So Mick, on the point of the power of social, the power of the consumer, companies respond to consumer preference and demand at the end of the day. So if you want to see real sustainable change, surely it's in the hands of the consumer through their buying power to choose which products they believe are those products that are offering that change. And so therefore, the education drive should be to educate the consumer to buy responsibly and to drive the change ultimately that will then filter throughout the entire value chain.
Absolutely, but right now they think buying responsibly means buying glass or paper because it's better for the environment. And as I said earlier, the global warming conversation's gone away, and it needs to be brought back to roost, because at the moment the war on plastic conversation is uneducated. So you see people going and buying a glass bottle, they're not understanding the power of the water, the transport, all the elements that go with that glass bottle. And you can't freeze a glass bottle of milk. So, we haven't talked about food wastage and the effect of that on the environment. So there are so many factors to consider. So for me, it's about education, simplistically, so that people consider, beyond just plastic, the other elements around buying for the planet.
Yeah.
So, as we saw in the graphs earlier, in certain instances, the effect of the environment by the plastic products is far less than the others. People don't know that. They need to know that, simply.
How realistic is this change in perception that you're undertaking, considering what you showed us around the stats?
Yeah.
And the sentiment around plastic is pretty negative, to put it mildly.
Yeah, it's huge. But what we're seeing is a massive surge from plastic manufacturers, people involved in plastic, and environmentalists. If you have a look at the latest press, or globally and locally, you're seeing a lot more pro-plastic articles and things happening. It's a long haul. It's a long game. It's not a short game. It takes significant investment. And most importantly, it takes partnerships between all the parties at play. You know, one of the things I don't talk about a lot because I'm dealing with the market that is most causing trouble at the moment, which is the social consumer market. That value chain education is incredibly important too. Within Safripol, we've created a wheel of responsibility, and each department and each area of Safripol understands their part and how they play into sustainability being at the core of the company now. And one could almost do that along the value chain. You know, here is your part to play in the sustainability message. And I agree that we need a single-minded, easily understood message that's propagated by all of us.
Yeah, because as someone who understands communication, it's when everyone is speaking off a different script that the message becomes jumbled and you actually lose all the impact at the end of the day. Are we heading in that direction? Are you confident that the building blocks are in place?
Yes, I think we're starting. We're at the beginning and there's a long way to go, but the change is positive. And you know, it's not just positive for us from a company perception or an economic point of view, it's positive for the planet. That's the reality. When people understand the materials better, they understand that every material is neither good nor bad, but has a role to play in our lives. And one mustn't over-subscribe to one product to the expense of the others, because that imbalance is what's causing a lot of the problem. So all good things in their right place.
Nikki, to bring you in on this point as we reach our conclusion, how do we reframe this negative rhetoric without being accused of greenwashing or, oh, this is just the industry, lobbying or trying to mask the fact that we still don't recycle enough, even though we've been speaking about this for decades? That is the likely response that you're going to hear in the market. How are you going to respond to that, considering what we know about life cycle analysis and what Mick was just talking about?
I think we've got to come at it from a number of angles. I think definitely the concept, I really like the concept of let's plastic responsibly, and I think that needs to be visible from the polymer producers right through the value chain to the end consumer, and starting to talk about how does that happen. So you talked earlier about, you know, consumers shifting their behavior. Well, sometimes it's actually up to the brand owner to say, well, we've made a choice. We know that we have gone, for example, I'll sing Unilever's praises here. We've decided to go 100% recycled content and 100% recyclable content on the following products. This is why, and this is how we've done it. Starting to talk about that actually can drive consumer behavior. It's talking about it's putting out there, we've taken it responsibly as a brand owner. We've made the following changes. Now, why don't you shift with us? And you know, I think that goes all the way through the value chain. So I don't think you're going to change the rhetoric overnight. I think it is a long haul, as Nick says. It's not something that you don't swing public opinion overnight. But I think it's also about framing the collaboration space. And I said this last year at the Safripol conference. We're not going to fix anything without collaboration. So it's every step of the value chain and working with consumers to say, well, how do we resolve this? And again, also making, you know, exactly what Nick says around making very clear why things are used. Why is plastic used? What is the benefit of plastic? But without saying, oh, it's better than X, Y, Z. I think the minute that you bring in the comparison with other substrates, you can get yourself into trouble because it just gets people's backs up. Rather than saying, for example, did you know that we wrap cucumbers to preserve their lives, to give them a 7 or 8 day longer shelf life? That stops food waste. So using, you know, simple examples like that, starting to talk about communicating, you know, the polypropylene tub research that we did, starting to talk about how do you reuse your ice cream tubs? How can we, you know, again, coming back to your product manufacturer, brand owner, and I'm hoping some brand owners are listening today, if they decide to change the shape of their yogurt tubs to drive better repurposing, they can talk about that. And that's not going, oh, well, I'm greenwashing and I'm just trying to make it better. It's actually a real, I've heard you, consumer. I'm changing what I'm doing for the better of you and the planet. And I think that's how I see this happening.
It's a data-driven conversation. Rob, your concluding thoughts on this matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just to echo what Nikki says. I think that consumers want to know when you make a change why you've made a change, and I think it's going to be the same with when the extended producer responsibility legislation becomes mandatory. There are some things that may end up costing a little bit more, and I think it's an opportunity for the brand owners and the retailers to say, this now costs 5 cents more than it used to, because that money is going into the infrastructure, the collection mechanisms, etc., to make this packaging that last year wasn't recyclable now becomes recyclable. So it's if you only give a little bit of information, that's when it becomes easy to be accused of being of greenwashing. So I think it's up to everyone involved in making these changes to have meaningful, honest conversations with the consumers, so that the consumers can understand not just that something has changed, but why we've taken that decision to change it, and what are the potential implications, and if there needs to be an associated consumer behavior to maximize that benefit, to make the consumer understand that when I put this particular thing in my recycling, if I take the lid off and separate the lid and the packaging, that saves somebody down the line time and effort for doing it. Or if it's got a shrink sleeve that's perforated, it's important for you to separate that sleeve from the bottle, because it makes it then a more attractive resource for an informal collector or someone like that. So I think, it's honest, meaningful conversation with consumers so that they can understand why things are changing.
Thanks, Rob. Mick?
That's so important. I agree completely. If you just reframe the conversation, then you get people to understand why. Without looking to alienate anybody, if you look at the Clover milk bottles moving to blue, my understanding was, from the messaging I saw, it was a move towards more environmentally friendly packaging. But while they did communicate it, which was good, the investment wasn't sufficient enough to get people to understand. And a lot of people just went, blue milk bottles, why are these? A lot of people asked the questions, Another good example is if you took the sugar tax and the cold drink manufacturers having to put sweeteners in, there wasn't a lot of talk around why and what and how bad sugar is for you and how the sweeteners could change your life and all those kinds of things. You could put a positive angle on it, which is a true angle, which would have changed things, because all we had was, my favorite drink doesn't taste the same anymore, I'm not happy about this. And then the explanation was, we're being taxed, so we don't want to pay, so we're going to put in more sweetener and less sugar. And that's very self-serving from a consumer point of view. You look at that and you go, you're just helping yourself. But I think if we take these individual things and we communicate the reasons behind them and the benefits of them, we'll have the public on our side. It won't be the other way around.
And you're educating, you're not explaining.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. When my information changes, I alter my conclusions. That's what John Maynard Keynes says, and I think that is what the industry is trying to do. Mick, Nikki, Rob, thank you very much. Very interesting session. We're all that stands between you and your lunch, so I'm not going to waffle on. I'm just going to remind you that lunch is at Tradewinds Restaurant. It's available from 1 o'clock, so it gives you about 4 minutes to grab another drink or something and get down to Tradewinds. We'll see you back here at 2 o'clock. We've got a nice panel lined up for you. We've got some brand owners. We've got a full panel, so we're going to really explore this in some depth after that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.